So today we're going to tackle a kind of difficult topic, and we're going to talk about QFactor. So I had a viewer ask recently to do a video about QFactor. I thought it was time. We've done a bunch of other ones, and this seems like a topic that keeps coming up. So first, we need to define what is QFactor, and think of it simply as sort of the stance of your bike, how far away your feet are. Now, the Q factor of the bike is technically measured, when we're talking Q factor on its own, and this is sort of a vague delineation of sort of definitions, but Q factor is from the outside of one crank to the outside of the other, and so it's not including the pedals most of the time, because we're just trying to compare apples to apples as far as bikes go, because the pedals throw another variable in there. When we, then put pedals on the bike and we're measuring how far our feet are from each other, width-wise, then more often than not, it often does get referred to as Q factor, but it can also be referred to, or you'll hear it referred to as your stance on the bike, or your stance width. Now, a number of years ago, there was this idea floating around that a narrower Q factor was going to be more efficient, more mechanically efficient. Get more power, more direct force into the pedals. It was kind of, all these terms were sort of bandied about. And the reasoning was partially that, this narrower Q factor would make for potentially a stiffer bike, and so be more mechanically efficient, and so it also would then be more biomechanically efficient for the rider. Now, this is around the time that the BB30 bottom bracket standard became kind of more popular. And if you're not unfamiliar with it, the BB30 bottom bracket, quite simply, is if you have a bottom bracket shell on a typical bike, take the two examples. On a typical bike that uses a Shimano or SRAM or Travative or whatever standard crank and spindle, that's where the spindle of the crankset, meaning the axle that connects the crank arms, is 24 millimeters in diameter. And of course in the SRAM it tapers down from 24 to 22. In the Shimano it's 24 and 24 on both sides. So we have that one. And those are usually built on a bottom bracket shell width of either 68 millimeters, often for road bikes, or 73 millimeters, often for the mountain bikes. The BB30 has the same width bottom bracket. However, the diameter of the bottom bracket is much larger to accommodate a 30 millimeter bearing. So the BB30 cranksets have a spindle that is 30 millimeters in diameter versus 24. So it was a much larger diameter spindle on the crankset. The big difference comes into play when, with our standard bottom bracket over here, we'll call it the standard bottom bracket, that is, say, 68 millimeters wide. That then, to put bearings onto that, it's threaded, and so we have external cups that thread into it, and they add roughly a centimeter, maybe a little less, on each side, where there is a bearing sitting outside the bottom bracket now. And so then the spindle is 24 millimeters in diameter, and it has to be the width of the bottom bracket plus the width of the bearings. Okay, so it's a little longer. On the BB30 side, those larger 30 millimeter bearings are pressed directly into the frame, and so there is no external bearings, and so we have a narrower overall width to the crankset. And so we have a larger diameter spindle, a larger diameter bearing, and a narrower overall width. And this then produces often a narrower Q factor on the bike, because it shrank everything down a little bit. Now, again, the idea was that this BB30 setup was going to be much stiffer. And the cranksets, you could kind of see where that was going. Larger diameter spindle, and it's a shorter spindle. And so you think, well, overall, that crankset is probably going to be stiffer than our standard crankset. But what they found out was, because we were actually shrinking the width of the bottom bracket shell itself, the bottom bracket shell was staying the same. However, we were no longer taking advantage of the extra width provided by the bearings, and also the benefit of having the bearings set a little further from the center line of the frame, which can provide some stability and some fatigue resistance, you might say, for the bearings, since they have a little wider stance. That when you factor in the stiffness of the frame and the stiffness of the crankset, actually there was not a big difference. The BB30s were really not any stiffer as a unit, or I should say as a combined unit, where we're talking frame and crankset stiffness. And that's why nowadays we have, still inset bearings are popular where we don't have external cups anymore, but there are more popular methods of going about this, like what they call the BB386, which essentially takes that standard Shimano crankset and widens the overall bottom bracket and then uses press-in bearings. So it is the same width as that, 68 millimeter bottom bracket shell plus the bearings on the outside. However, those bearings are just enclosed in a bottom bracket that's wider. So that's where this debate about QFactor kind of really started over again. Now, there are three primary factors to determining how wide your stance is or how wide your QFactor is. And they are, again, determined by the three things we talked about. It's going to depend on the width of the bottom bracket, and again, whether that bottom bracket has external bearings or internal bearings. It will depend on the type of crankset. Each crankset kind of has a slightly different amount that it moves away from the center line of the frame. And to some of that, it will depend on whether it's a single, a double, or a triple crankset. And also just their differences among manufacturers, and also what type of bike it was meant for. And then the final determinant is, again, this goes back to more stance width, but it is determined by the pedal, how long the pedal spindle is, where the center of the pedal is. Now why would one bike have a wider QFactor than another? Again, we talked about the bottom brackets, but the reason for putting the crank arms further away from each other goes to kind of the function of the bike, and it has to do with, to some extent, the main determinant is just how wide of a tire that is meant for that bike. So as the tire gets wider, then the chainstays have to be set slightly wider apart also. And the crankset, because it's turning and it comes in close proximity to the chainstay, it has to, essentially, that crankset that needs to be far away enough from the center line of the bike so that it doesn't hit the crankset. So a road bike is going to have a much narrower QFactor than a mountain bike, right? And that's why we're seeing today a lot of this start to creep back up, because now we're seeing people with plus bikes, mountain bikes that take up to 3-inch tires or greater, or fat bikes with 4 and 5-inch wide tires. And now we're talking about having to really get the cranks around chainstays that are having to then get around a 5-inch tire. Now, where are the QFactors? And again, this I'm going to relate this. This is not related to the pedals themselves. So just the outer crank measurements. A typical road bike is going to be somewhere in the 140 millimeter, in the 140s somewhere for QFactor. A mountain bike, for instance, that takes perhaps up to 2.5-inch tires might be in the 150s or low 160s. And then when we get into plus bikes and beyond, 3-inch tires on a plus bike, you can be in the 160s to maybe even low 70s. And then 4 and 5-inch bikes that accept 4 and 5-inch tires, you could easily be in the 180s. I've seen some close to 200. And what is happening is people are noticing on these much wider 4 and 5-inch bikes especially, that the QFactor is too much for them, at least for long distances. They can tolerate it for shorter periods, but it can be awkward for some. So let's talk about bike fit in relation to QFactor. And there's a lot here, and it's also something that doesn't get addressed really hardly at all. I think it's because it's an idea that's poorly understood. As I mentioned, there are many instances where cyclists can find relief from certain problems by on their road bikes, especially by widening the QFactor slightly in some cases. And it's important to note that from a bike fit standpoint, that it is actually a very likely scenario that a rider will benefit from having the QFactor of one pedal be further out than the other, meaning having an asymmetric setup. Why is this the case? Because nobody is symmetrical on their bike. And we've talked about this, I've talked about this in past videos many times. So if we're not symmetrical on our bike, that means we're not addressing the saddle or our pedals in a symmetric way either. And so it makes some sense that we could relieve some of this asymmetric motion with an asymmetric foot position. Now, this is something you have to be really careful of, has to be tested, has to be kind of verified with really good objective information. But it is a solution that is available to those able to discern these things. So how do I look at this when I'm doing a bike fit? Well, I look at a lot of different things. I look at especially some of the infrared data to see how their hips are moving. What are their ankle mechanics like? How is their knee tracking? I can look at some saddle pressure and some pelvic stability and movement analysis, and I can kind of see, okay, how is their pelvis sitting on the saddle? How are they moving over the saddle? What type of propensity does their pelvis have? And from all this information, that's where I can kind of make a decision and see, okay, would this person's mechanics be improved by moving one or both feet, in or out a little bit relative to the center line of the frame? In my experience, a rider who has, for instance, more external rotation at the hip or more eversion at the foot and ankle, essentially someone who toes out more, or someone who maybe when they walk a little bit more duck-footed, we say, or toe out. These people will often absorb wider Q factors easier. Now, it's not always necessary for them to have a wider Q factor, although this can be the case. But they are often, as I said, more often to do well with a wider Q factor or not have as many problems. And here's a really simple way to think about it. It's altogether reasonable that a smaller rider may need a narrower Q factor and that a larger rider may need a wider one. It's not always the case, but that's, again, if we're talking generalizations, that's not a terrible one to start with. Interesting thing that came up when I was looking at some of the research was one study that was trying to figure out if we could figure out what is the ideal Q factor. And I'm going to have to do a to be continued on this one a little bit because I'm still trying to get the full copy of this research article. It was pretty interesting, though, is they used a hanging task, they call it. And I can only assume, and that's why I need to get the full documentation, but I can only assume that it refers to some means of, say, suspending the person from like a chin-up bar, essentially, and seeing where their legs and where their feet hang. Now, based on that, I'm guessing that they would probably measure from like their ankles and measure a width to see sort of what their hanging width. That might give her, it's a non-weight bearing width. That'll give you an idea of what the person's Q factor might be. That's an interesting one. I'm not espousing that that's the way to go about it. In this research article, they seem to think it was worthwhile enough to include. And it's something I'm going to take a look at a little bit further because it definitely seems kind of interesting. So Q factor is a topic like many that we've discussed in previous videos. It's not as simple as most people will talk about it, and in fact, it's also something that is going to be more nuanced, and it's going to be very individual. So the downside is that this isn't a really easy thing to just test, just because the equipment involved tends to be fairly expensive. I mean, to get a wider or narrower Q factor, it would entail getting a different crankset or different pedals or both, most of the time at least. Now, there's a couple of cheap options. You can run a couple of spacers between one pedal and the crank arm, but you can only do that a limited amount. Some people do sell pedal extenders that are stainless steel pieces that thread into the crank arm, and you can put your pedals in there. It moves the pedals out about 20 millimeters, which is a lot. But it might give you an idea of what a wider Q factor is going to do for you. Just note that these don't work with every type of pedal out there. So I'd love to hear your experiences with wider or narrower Q factors. Have you struggled with, for instance, plus bikes or fat bikes? Are there some people out there that on their road bikes, they've really had to work to get a much narrower than average Q factor in order to be comfortable? Put those in the comments below. I'd love to hear from you. Check out some of my other videos, and I'd appreciate it if you would subscribe. Thanks for hanging in there, and we'll see you next time. Thanks.